Today is Friday, October the 4th, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here with my co-host, Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, you're leaving tomorrow for the feast, aren't you?
I am. Actually, atonement and the feast. So, yes, it is a hectic day. We hope to record this Friday, but we had to do it today, Monday, yeah.
So just so everybody knows, now I know this kind of counts, I assume this counts, getting to the airport, how long you're in the airport, layovers, the whole overall travel time. But it sounds like you're in the plane for a couple of days.
And I keep saying the wrong number of days. It hit me. I think I've done the math wrong. But yeah, we'll be in the air for over 2 days. It's 2.
Yeah.
But yeah, above the earth, floating around. Well, not floating around, but yeah. But we're looking forward to it. We're very excited to see brethren in Malaysia for atonement, and then in Australia for the feast itself. It's been very hectic getting things together, but we're very much looking forward to the trip.
All right, excellent. So in that vein, we already previewed a little our podcast today.
We did. That's right. At the end of the last one, right? Today we want to, based on a listener recommendation and request, we want to think feastily, if you will, looking forward into the future at the coming millennial reign of Christ, and just talk about a few more things that we're looking forward to in that time.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, let's do that. Thank you, Jake and Julia. And I have to say, Mr. Robinson's going to be in the air quite a bit himself, headed to Kenya for the feast. Did you say about a day in the airplane there, Mr. Robinson?
I haven't calculated like by the when we leave Charlotte and then the travel to London, then you switch your plane and you fly to Nairobi. Exactly, because that exactly what that time span is. But I mean, we kind of lose a day in there, more or less. But end up and I don't know. It's a lot of travel, but we relatively experienced travelers, so we're ready.
I had fun with a spreadsheet yesterday trying to look at the trip, and I made an hour by hour spreadsheet, which kept track of the hours in Charlotte, but then also the hours wherever we are in our multiple locations. And we'll be stopping in Qatar for a layover and different places. And so you can, and I created some conditional formatting so the hours would look blue if it was daytime hours, and look gray if they're nighttime hours, with red for sunrise or sunset hours. And so you can, it was fun to see them side by side to see how we'll shift away from Charlotte time, and then I have it interpolating during the flight. And then I can't tell you the satisfaction when you've gone down 500 some odd rows for all these hours, and to see when you land the hours actually match up again. You just feel like you're the king of spreadsheets when you do stuff like that. It feels good.
I've said it before, maybe not on the podcast. I'm thankful there's people that like to do that, but that is not me.
It was, I gotta admit, it was fun. Okay, but that's not what our topic about. We're not talking about the joys of flying or staying off the ground. We are here to talk about the millennium. That's what we're all going to be meditating on this feast. And we do encourage you, both Mr. Robinson and I do, when you're at the feast, think about that coming reign. Try to picture it in your mind. Try to take the time to imagine how much better this world will be when Jesus Christ and his saints are actually running the world. And we're going to give you a bit of a list of things that we look forward to in the millennium, and some of them are going to blend a little bit, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's no clear rules here. But that said, it's not the same as your list. In fact, go back and listen to our old one. I didn't write down what number that podcast was, Mr. Robinson, but
I think it's in here, isn't it?
Is it in there somewhere?
Oh no, you didn't.
You didn't write it down?
No.
Okay, regardless, we did it, I don't know, I think it was just last year. I think it was last year this same time. I think it was September last year. But regardless, we'll try to add a link to it to the livingyouth.org website, which, by the way, you ought to go out to the website sometimes every once in a while. We're trying to add more additional material than just the podcast to that. But go back and listen to those. But we did pick 5 different things this time. So let's start with the first. And both Mr. Robinson and I talk about this, and that is, we look forward to the millennial temple. There will be a physical temple on earth during the millennium, and it is described in great detail in the last chapters of Ezekiel. And if you're really into architecture, well, then that is the chapter. Those are the sections of the Bible for you, because Ezekiel goes into great detail about the architecture of the coming temple. But it's about more than that. It's kind of a headquarters that God intends to be here on planet Earth. And Jesus Christ says, that is the place of the soles of my feet. This is the place that will be like his headquarters building. But it serves more of a purpose than that. It's actually meant to inspire, to move, to cause contemplation. And he inspires Ezekiel to write in Ezekiel 43 and verse 9. Sorry, starting in verse 10, Ezekiel 43 and verse 10, he tells Ezekiel, "Son of man, describe the temple to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and let them measure the pattern. And if they are ashamed of all they've done, make known to them the design of the temple and its arrangement, its exits and its entrances, its entire design and all its ordinances, all its forms and all its laws. Write it down in their sight, so they may keep its whole design and all its ordinances and perform them. This is the law of the temple. The whole area surrounding the mountaintop is most holy. Behold, this is the law of the temple." And that place is going to mean something to God. And consequently, not just do I look forward to it because I look forward to having a place like that and working with a place like that and using it as a headquarters to serve humanity, but honestly, Mr. Robinson, I think it is going to be absolutely beautiful. I think it's going to be a beautiful place.
Yes, I really do look forward to seeing it. There was a show on Netflix last year, Ancient Apocalypse, and he just went around the earth to all these like leftover amazing, what do they call them,
Like
mega structures.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah. And man, it's who knows why, but there's this like really intricate stonework that's really finely done that's around the world that just fits together. But the most amazing and the one of them all really is the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau, and they can tell how precisely they were made. Anyway, it just kind of, now I may not be a spreadsheet guy, but I do like geography and architecture, and to see God actually show humanity what he's going to do, because each temple, I know that technically the first temple was a little more glorious than the second temple, but of course Christ went to the second temple, and thus making it more glorious.
But
right? It's like the temple just keeps getting bigger, and so this Ezekiel one is going to be huge in size and scale. And I appreciate you mentioning the various things that it's going to signify. One of the things that upset Christ when he went in and turned over the money changers was, this is not what the temple's for. This is not for business. It's for a house of prayer for all nations. And to see it finally really get to be done the way God always intended it to be, I think is pretty exciting. And to see, we could do a different podcast on why this is the case, but to see a actually functioning Levitical priesthood operating there again, and it will be, I think, and that Christ will be there.
Right. And people wonder about that sometimes, and we could go into a whole lot of detail. We do. In fact, Mr. Jonathan Manair has asked me, I did a Bible study here in Charlotte on the Ezekiel temple, and he's asked me to put that together for online living ed, and I just keep not doing it. I need to do it. But yeah, people wonder about that. But just because there's a Levitical priesthood, which is clearly described in the latter parts of Ezekiel, it does not mean that the priesthood according to Melchizedek is not functioning. Dr. Hay explained that way back, even in the Worldwide Church of God, that the Melchizedek priesthood was never intended to do physical kind of service in that sort of way. It's a spiritual, we'll be serving people in that priesthood, versus when you see the descriptions of the sons of Zadok, et cetera, in the latter parts of Ezekiel, they are clearly doing the things of the physical kinds of things. So, no, it's a matter of, Levi, as is made plain in Hebrews, Levi was in submission, kind of through the loins, if you will, of Abraham, paying tithes to Melchizedek. So there is definitely a proper structure there. There's so much to be talked about in regard. Actually, it was you, Ms. Robinson. I haven't thought about this, and it's the kind of observations that I appreciate being mentioned, but you mentioned, as either you or your missus, I can't recall which now, but you talked about it being a river city at that time, that Jerusalem,
yes,
that you don't think of it that way now, of course, Jerusalem, but that it is going to actually be one.
Well, the reconfiguration of the earth appears like it's going to be quite considerable. I mean, there's all the upheaval throughout the day of the Lord, and there's lots of scriptures in there. You read the one in your sermon on the trumpets about that the every mountain and every island will be moved out of its place, but Christ's own personal return, it's melting mountains under his feet as he comes down, and it talks about a great earthquake that kind of reconfigures the geography.
It talks about the Mount of Olives being split, there, and yeah, definitely.
So and my wife and I had an opportunity right before the uprising back in the 90s, because it was relatively peaceful there in the Middle East. And so we went to Israel for the feast, and we got to go up on the Temple Mount and see it and everything, which was pretty neat. I mean, you could, obviously there's no temple on it, but you could see the scale of the Temple Mount. And back then they would still let you go into the Dome of the Rock.
Oh, they did.
And so
wow.
we actually went in there. But you could kind of stand there and imagine a little bit that temple sitting there. And it's like large and magnificent. Apparently, if you came from the east in particular, you couldn't really see Jerusalem. Then you kind of come over this rise, and suddenly the city was right there, and the temple dominated the landscape and everything.
It would be easy having come over, there on the Mount of Olives and seen that. They're so easy to imagine, and they talk about how the doors and stuff, the gold plating, etc., would just make it shine, with the eastern sun shining on it. And no, I think that is. We'll talk a little bit more about the beautification of things a little bit later. But before we leave this, when you really look, it's not just that it's not just the temple building in the center of it all. But God talks about this entire district. There's this vast swath of land around it that is to be considered kind of holy, is to be taken care of. And then you've got areas for residences a little distance from that. But the whole area is and I tend to think of it as this beautiful, manicured kind of park, this sort of area that is meant. Well, honestly, I never got to see it in its prime. I've only seen it ever since the church way back when sold it. But kind of like what Pasadena was there on the campus, this kind of where people really tend to it and they want something to be beautiful.
Yeah, I had an opportunity to go to the Pasadena campus when I was 18, and it really was quite impressive. What you could do if you really set to, and I'm not saying that the Pasadena campus, all the buildings were all amazing. It was kind of a bit of a mix, but some of them were, and then the landscaping that went with it. I mean, you talk about like a manicured. People say, "Oh, this lawn is manicured." Well, I mean, that campus was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I might. What it makes me think of, actually, if there's many things that you could criticize Manhattan Island, New York City for.
Okay.
There's one thing that, maybe a couple things even, that they got right, and one of them was Central Park.
Really?
And that amazing. What is it? I don't even want to guess the dimensions on it, but it's sizable enough that it's notable, and that they've held the line on. I can't believe some developer hasn't convinced them to build out a section of it. But I think of that, just bustling city right next to a huge open greenway, and I'm not at all saying Jerusalem will feel anything like New York City. I don't mean that. It's just, what's a modern equivalent that kind of gives you an idea of what it is?
Yeah, it's interesting because really the city kind of surrounds Central Park. Here it's like the park will surround the temple area. But have you been to Central Park? Have you actually experienced? See, I have not. I've seen the photos, of course, and seen some of the view. In fact, even recently saw a view from a high-rise building looking down, and it is this beautiful. I mean, maybe down deep inside it's not as beautiful anymore, but all I know is from the view above, you realize the pressure that must be on some to think, we could just develop this a little bit more, but that it's worth preserving that in the city. When we went,
it was awesome. It was just a beautiful day. We didn't really know exactly what we were doing, and we got off at the New York Met, which happened to be right there. Everybody from New York is, doing the eye roll. But we got off the subway stop there, and there's the New York Metropolitan Museum, and it's a pretty neat structure. And then right behind it is Central Park. And the thing is, even though you can kind of tell it must be big if you look at like a satellite view or something of it, it still doesn't do justice to the scale of it when you actually see it in real life. Wow. It's a sizable park.
I look forward to seeing it sometime. Okay, we'll come back to some sense of beauty and stuff, because one of our points later is going to touch on that. At least one, actually, maybe more than one. But the second point we want to talk about today is the opportunity that the presence of the reign of Christ is going to give in the world, of seeing different people groups truly develop. That is different. We've said for I don't know how many decades in the church that nations are really families grown large. If you look in Zechariah 14, it talks about the family of Egypt, right? But the world has just been so, it's just been a difficult place ever since mankind kicked God out, if you will, back in the Garden of Eden. Then the world has not developed in the way that God wanted. But God wanted people to have homes. If you look at his laws, and we've talked about these laws in other podcasts, if you look at his intention with Israel, he wants people to have a homeland. He wants you to have a place that you always know is going to be yours and is going to be your family's. And it even says in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 8, it's kind of a sentence out of nowhere, but it says, when the Most High, speaking of the ancient peoples, it says, when the Most High divided their inheritance to the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the children of Israel. That is, there's always been a plan, and the plan was always about more than just Israel. It wasn't really just about Israel. Paul refers to the same thing when he says in Acts 17, verse 26, and he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their preappointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. So he has intended man to just spread all over the earth into different places, and yes, in the mountains and in the valleys and all these different places. But what has mankind been riven by all these years? By war and famines and greed. And you have like the people of Israel, well, ancient, as in like literally the people of the man Israel, having to move, right? Because there's famines in the land and trying to seek shelter. You have wars that press one people to another, or people are relocated here and there. Mankind has never peacefully been able to truly develop according to the way God intended, so that coastal people could just develop as coastal people without others coming to steal their resources. So the people in places that were once verdant but start to turn harsh don't have to move someplace else because the way the weather patterns are shifting. They're losing their sustenance. And during the millennium, you'll actually have people be able to develop in various regions. And I think of the different customs and the different, I say languages for now. However, we're coming to that in point 3, but the different music and the different food that won't be burdened by sin, but will develop under the coverage of God's law. So developed in right ways. I think it's going to be something beautiful.
So I've kind of come full circle on this. Your discourse just now made me think of many things. And then by the time you finished up, I had lost all of it.
It was a bit of a rant, yeah.
I think there's some things, the part of the idea here, what you're saying is, and I actually went and looked it up, there is actually took my glasses off.
We need glasses.
Proverbs 29:2,
okay.
And it's, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. And that's, one of the many, many things that Christ has on his agenda when he returns. Taking people, taking the kings under the King of Kings and, dispersing them. We don't know exactly how he'll do it, but sending out leaders of righteousness that will, because I've growing up in a very safe United States of America did not help me understand how most people had lived. And I think I said to you one time, this is several months ago, well, people say, what's the oldest profession? People say nothing's certain but death and taxes. When I say one of the original greatest economic, what do you call it? Where you have a economic policy was, well, we'll get all our guys together and go raid somebody else and steal all their stuff.
Right.
There's a really kind of sad story. I don't think it's designed to make the tribe of Dan look good at all. But at the end of Judges, and Dan hadn't really cleared out their territory, so they needed a new space, and so they found this group of people that was living quite peaceably. But nope, they didn't have any link to other people, and so there was nobody there really to look after him. And Dan just went in and wholesale slaughtered them.
Wow!
And it doesn't seem to be preserved as something that was good that they had done. And just the record of mankind, what the raiding, what the Vikings were incredible, but what did they do? They just went along the coastlands and raided everybody.
Right.
They went up and down the rivers and raided everybody. And for people to actually finally be safe, The other thing that happens is even if you get a relatively peaceful group, what seems to happen is over time, eventually, one of the narcissistic sociopaths works their way to the top, and then the leaders become corrupt over time, and then God talks about this quite a bit with the motif of the shepherd, and he calls Israel's shepherds at the end are terrible shepherds, and not only are they not taking care of the sheep, they're just taking advantage of the sheep and extracting wealth out of them is kind of an idea that's going on there. And you just see that like some of these countries we've seen over the last 100 years, some of what feels like what's gone on in Venezuela. You just get guys at the top and they don't really care about the people, and they just extract all the wealth out of it. There's some accusations of that in Ukraine, that some of the leaders of Ukraine, same kind of thing happening. So whether that's happening for sure or not, the point is it'll be an end to leaders just kind of taking advantage of their citizens for their own profit. A very small group of people profits, everybody else suffers.
Yes, and with that changed, you have this opportunity that mankind, that even though, yes, we've had different cultures, we have different foods, songs, style, all those kind of things, but it's never truly been able to develop the way that God would design the world. And with all of that changed, you really have something different. And it's, I appreciate what you said a while ago. It made me think of, how the Bible talks about kings sending their princes to Israel to serve. And the idea, you think, well, what is it? Is it like slavery? Is it something terrible? Well, no, think about it. If you're in a foreign land and you see all the wonderful things happening in Israel, you want your son to go serve. If you would send your princes to go serve, because then they come back and they bring all that knowledge. He's going to, yes, we are going to guide peoples, but I still get the sense that he's going to want the peoples themselves to be interested and to learn.
Yep. Well, that was Israel's original purpose. That God called them and set them apart and gave them his laws. And if they had executed properly, they would be prosperous, and all the nations around them would say, who is this? Yeah, would look, what's this amazing nation that doesn't have all these problems? And they briefly achieved that under the reign of Solomon. And so I actually wonder how long that really was, because Solomon reigned 40 years, but it sounds like the last 10 years, maybe taxes went up and he wasn't doing the best he can. So maybe the golden age was actually only 20 to 30 years.
A brief shining moment.
But what happened? The Queen of Sheba went to go and see if everything she's heard is true.
Right.
And it said there was no question that Solomon wasn't able to answer for her.
Yeah, in many ways, Solomon's reign is like a faulty, as they always are, but picture of the millennial time. And it's easy to think then, and this is where the point comes in, that with all that happening, the world will turn into a giant monoculture. And I'll just say that's not the way humanity works or how we're designed to work. We'll get into language in the next point, but even just ignoring language, you're going to have regional dances, regional music, even I would say regional ways of life. God's law doesn't actually enforce a monoculture. Within God's law, there is a certain amount of liberty to do things one way or another. Like modest clothing doesn't only look one way. There's a beautiful range of clothing that can be modest. And so when you have cultures developing, just like imagine how your family is living God's way as best you can, and then there's another family that's not you, that's also living God's way. Do you have all exactly the same likes, all exactly the same taste in food, all exactly the same taste in music? No, you don't. You vary. Well, now expand that across the world, and you will still get different cultures, different celebrations, not pagan celebrations, and not ignoring God's designed and his enforced celebrations, but your own celebrations. And now imagine all that variety coming into Jerusalem for the feast. And it's going to be beautiful and wondrous. And it's not going to be a matter of shaming one culture with another. It's going to be a matter of celebrating what others have done within the scope of God's law.
I really love that point a lot, and I appreciate you making that. Mr. O'Gwen often would point out, if you go through his Bible studies on the four gospel accounts, and when, Christ choosing his disciples and training them, he would point out all the time how very different they were. He has Matthew the tax collector, which to most Jews would be considered a collaborator with the Romans, one of the more hated designations. And then you have Simon the Zealot, zealot being a specific designation, meaning he was dedicated to the overthrow of the Romans.
That's
so
right.
you kind of wonder how some lunches went. But he would go on and point out the different personalities of the different disciples, and then apostles that Christ worked with, and they all had their own personalities. The 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, you can go read at the end of Genesis when Jacob talks about what there's identifiable traits that last. So there seems to be personalities. Why do I like to go to France, and other people have different areas they like to go to? It's because it's French. It's Frenchy. It's French style. The French do it a way that's kind of neat, and I love that. And God likes some variety. I mean, he wants us to have a common, say, ethic and moral, i.e., that's defined by God's laws. But at the same time, he expects people to have a little bit of a different approach, a different take. It's not one necessarily better than the other, although, I mean, I do think the French make the best bread in the world, but we could talk about it. So I like that point a lot. Sometimes people do. I've seen people kind of like really undervalue personality and kind of feel like everybody should conform, but in their mind, conform means we all behave exactly the same way.
Right, and it doesn't. You don't have to all be the same. That's such an interesting example concerning the disciples, because they did have to cast aside the sin. If Matthew had done any cheating of people as a tax collector, he had to repent of that. In terms of being a zealot and deciding, I'm going to overthrow the Roman Empire, he had to repent of that. So you repent of sins, but that doesn't mean there's not still differences of personality. Can you be an extrovert and be a Christian? Yes. Can you be an introvert and be a Christian? Yes, you can. You cast aside the sin, but what's left still is some differences. And so the idea that the coastal peoples are going to have food and things that they prepare, they're going to be very different than the people from the plains. And I look forward to seeing a world where all of those differences actually they blossom not in strife and in conflict, but actually, if you will, like a garden with an active gardener who is Jesus Christ, who is actively cultivating the beauty and variety, just like a garden, in the world for an entire 10 centuries. Yes. I think that's marvelous.
Well, I know we're wrapping this point up, but like, so this is actually the second time we went to France. I don't remember.
Okay.
Well, I think we've been 5 times.
Wow.
And this feast site was much closer to Germany. It was in the Lorraine region. And so it had a much more of you could see some German influence in it. But the little place we stayed, which is kind of like a fancy KOA almost. It was kind of rustic, but it had everything you needed, and they made the food there, which was fantastic, and we ate on site. But one evening when I say the bar, it's kind of a European style bar. It's just where people collected. And so they had the bartender, but he offered me some grappa that's only made in that region, that had been made by the same family for 5 or 6 generations. He was part of that family, so he was proud of it. And I noted that because in America, we don't tend to think that way. And I thought it was really neat that here, because I really do believe that long term, when the millennium really reaches its fullness and the nations are thriving, that, man, you could travel through one region and have a cheese that's only made here, and then a cheese that's only made down here, and just they say, so for example, with wine, the climate makes a huge difference, and the ground the soil makes a huge difference. And so, you could just see traveling through each area would have a unique and distinct style, but it's all wine, but it's such a variety within wine.
Oh boy. Okay. So I'm glad we're excited about that. I do think that would be a beautiful part of the millennium. Okay. So the next one it was hard not to touch on it with the last one. But the Bible does seem to indicate that we can expect a new language to be given to the world. I say given, we'll talk about that, to the world in the millennium. And so for this third point, I was going to read from Zephaniah 3 and verse 9. In Zephaniah 3 and verse 9, it says, "For then this is God speaking, for then I will restore to the peoples a pure language, that they all may call on the name of the Eternal, to serve him with one accord." Now, what does that mean? Our languages today are corrupt with various ideas that I don't think God wants to have in a language he would make. We say Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, and those are tied to pagan names, and Sunday. Monday is from Moon Day. Now, that doesn't mean it's wrong to use them, just so you know. Sometimes that comes up. Do I have to say first day of the week and second day of the week so I don't use pagan names? No, and how do we know even from the Bible? After the exile, you see in the Old Testament that instead of some of the original names, and there's very few original names that we read in the Bible of the months of the year, you do start seeing the names that they learned in Babylon for the months, and God still has that in the Bible. So yes, you're not worshiping those deities. You're not worshiping the moon when you call Monday Monday. But that said, that what I see in Zephaniah 3 and verse 9 is that God does plan on teaching people another language and giving a new language that won't be corrupt, that when you do sing praises to God, we won't have words that have been tainted by other kinds of meanings. And we've generally understood this to mean that there will be a new language that personally I don't think it's going to be not going to be snap your fingers and everybody suddenly speaks a different language. I think rather it's going to be a matter of learning that language. I know we're speculating here, but I do look forward to that because as much as I'm a math guy, I like languages. I wish that I had devoted more time to learning languages. And this is going to sound terribly nerdy, but it is the truth. It's not so much learning real languages that got me into language, but Mr. Robinson, I don't know if you remember yeah, surely you do. Our age is very similar. The original Star Trek movies. We're not endorsing them,
Okay.
but yeah, the very first one in the 70s, I think it was, I don't think it was 1980. I think it was before, I think it was 78 or so. Star Trek, the motion picture, or often called Star Trek, the motionless picture, because man, was it dull.
It was.
Star Trek, the slow motion picture. I've heard that one too. But then you had the second one, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Then you had the third one. And the third one featured a lot of Klingons, this alien race in Star Trek, very warlike, very, very aggressive. And they actually developed a language for that. They had a fellow named Mark Okrand, I think, actually develop a grammar and a structure. And being the little nerd that I was, I literally did get at the time, Klingon English dictionary because I was fascinated by this when I learned there was a real structure, and it kind of appealed to my math senses. And it did make me intrigued. I took Latin in high school, and Latin is very structured language in that regard. And I was always fascinated by languages in that way, but not enough to actually make room to learn them in my own life. But so the idea that God is going to give a language that he has theoretically designed, that he has put together, I think is fascinating. And I would love to peer through time and see the details of that grammar and that mechanics and how it's structured. And anyway, so that I'm looking forward to having a different language.
You know, I've thought about the language thing more as I've gotten older. In the past, when I was younger, I didn't really care about that kind of stuff. But as I've gotten older, I've started to appreciate that kind of thing, and I want to hear it more than anything else. I want to know what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Because if you're an American, then you obviously only know English in most cases. And so all the other languages, of course, you can hear the sound to them, and the German has lots of hard sounds to it, but the French is a much more kind of fluid, yeah, and on down the line. And then, so I'm fascinated to hear what it sounds like. Is it going to sound pretty? Is it going to sound kind of workmanlike, just down, knowing God, it'll have a flourish to it.
It's, and someone might speculate that it's going to be Hebrew, obviously, or something. I wouldn't jump to that.
Yeah.
I don't think that,
I totally agree.
It's like other languages in terms of how things have changed. I would not assume that at all. And I do agree. You would think it's going to be beautiful, but then beauty can be in the eye of the beholder in that sense. So what will it be like, and how many other languages? And I do think that just because you have one language that would be taught and spread, does that mean that different regions won't have their own languages? I don't know that that's the case, but I would, let's say even that weren't the case. Let's say that it's kind of mandated. Hey, once you learn this language, we're all speaking it. That's the way it works in the world. But then you could still expect there's going to be regional differences because it's virtually impossible. If you look at entropy, all these other kind of ideas, it's virtually impossible that a people that lives in its own region will not eventually develop its own dialect. We even see that in the Bible, actually. One of my favorite little just, I don't know. I like these real life kind of small moments, even though it's kind of terrible because they're killing people.
I was going to say, it's a little dark.
Yeah, it is. But in Judges chapter 12 and verse 5, you had, let's say they had their eye out for some Ephraimites. And it says, the Gileadites seized the fords of the Jordan before the Ephraimites arrived. And when any Ephraimite who escaped said, let me cross over, the men of Gilead would say to him, are you an Ephraimite? And if he said no, they would say to him, then say Shibboleth. And he would say Sibboleth, not Shibboleth, for he could not pronounce it right. Then they would take him and kill him at the fords of the Jordan. And there fell at that time 42,000 Ephraimites. Wow. Now, of course, that is dark. I'm not trying to celebrate what was going on. However, the thing is, why did they have them say that specific word? Because they're speaking a common tongue, but the Ephraimites had developed a different dialect, a different kind of accent. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I was working as an actuary, my boss, I've mentioned her before here, good friend of mine, Annie, she was from Quebec. And her previous company that she had worked at only 2 weeks before I worked at this company was actually only, I think, people from Quebec. And so so she really had not spoken a great deal of English. And she was very concerned about a few different things. And she told me, please watch out in meetings. If I say something wrong, let me know. But among the things she struggled with was, I think, the TH sound. She just, like we'd say for thee, that, thy, it was such a struggle for her. And she would work on that. And she remembers her teacher trying to get her to do the TH sound. And we take it for granted that we can do it, but it's not a part of their language.
Did I share with you before, let alone on the podcast, what I learned? I watched a couple of, so I don't know, back in the day, this would have been, a learning show on PBS, but it was how speech develops in babies.
Oh, no.
Okay. I thought this was fascinating. When a new baby is born, and it does not matter if it's born a Chinese baby, an American baby, a German baby, it does not matter. Every baby is born and equipped with the ability to pronounce and hear every sound of any language. Doesn't matter. But what happens over the next 2 years is they start to specialize in the one language they hear all the time. And by the time I think they're 2, all the other languages, this is the way it was kind of portrayed, I thought was interesting, kind of die within them. And they're no longer able to hear all the sounds or make the sounds anymore. But if you had a child, let's say you had a child who grew up speaking English, but had a French, one of the parents was French, mm-hmm. and they spoke French to dad and English to mom, and so they could pick up and hear the word. So like if you hear a second language it has to be a native speaker, and you have to be able to see their face. Then they can hear.
It's not just the hearing.
It's not just the hearing. The seeing mattered apparently, and I thought that was the most fascinating thing. And then the other thing is, even when you learn a second language, so you might think that let's say I learned Spanish, that when I speak Spanish I have to concentrate on Spanish and bring the Spanish out, and it's actually the opposite. You're having to suppress your native languages or the other language. You suppress. So I think I see this occasionally with a notable Spanish speaker here. When they speak in English, the Spanish is bubbling up a little into there, and they have to push the Spanish down so they can focus on staying in English. And I thought that was fascinating.
Would that be Mr. Hernandez?
We're gonna take that out. And, yes, it was Mr. Hernandez, who also speaks incredible French as well.
Oh, he does. He is a was a polyglot. Is that what I think that's the word?
Is that poly?
I think that's the word, polyglot.
Huh.
Yeah, multi-language. So
I have one other thing I want to point out. What you just did such a good job with this topic, Mr. Smith.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, I remember growing up before TV had the impact I think it's had now. So when I grew up in Texas, and there was clearly a Texas accent. But then when I was 21, I lived briefly in North Carolina, ironically, and I had learned there was clearly a detectable Southern accent that was different by state. There was a Georgia one, there was a South Carolina one, there was an Alabama one, and now I can barely tell. I can't tell a difference anymore, and which I put to TV, and like we have so much. We hear so much from people on TV or the news or whatever that I think we've actually lost the accents.
Hmm.
And I remember when I was 18 and my brother was with me, and my dad had given us both Brit Rail passes. And so we just left London and started going. No, we left London and went up to England. But the thing about England, for example, which I wonder if it's still this way.
London's in England.
Yes. What did I say?
You said went out from London to England.
Oh, up through England.
Okay,
just along the rail line. And what was interesting is, at least to my ear, in the southern part of England was by far the easiest to hear, and then maybe there was the Cockney one that was a little rough, but then as you move up, it changes, and when you get to Scotland, you clearly have a different accent. And then by the time we got to Inverness, I remember thinking, are we sure this is still English? Because the Scottish accent was so insane that far north, and I just don't think we have the same degree of accents like you said, lots of regional accents and dialect might be too far, but that
Sure.
would occur, and it's neat though. I think
it's
it's
neat. I think that'll be part of the variety that will bless us. It does remind me. It's not exactly the same. It reminds me of the Winston Churchill's comment that Americans and Britons are two people divided by a common language. I thought that was kind of witty. Of course, go figure, Mr. Churchill. But yeah, I do look forward to that language. I look forward to seeing its details. I look forward to seeing how our different dialects or accents or something might come out, and also just the knowledge that it'll be a designed language. Because the idea of as a hobby, conlang, which is constructed languages, I think is very very fascinating. I'll admit before we move on that my first, I don't know if it was my first, I doubt it was my first feast. I don't think I was so bold, but my second feast at least, I remember making happy Feast of Tabernacles cards to some of my close friends, but writing it in Klingon, translating it.
Nice.
That'd
be kind of fun.
Yeah, it was. They were nerds, and they would appreciate it. But I look forward to the new language. All right, we're on the last two. We did hope to have 5 of these things today. The second to last one is I am looking forward to music in the millennium. I am a music guy, but not a music playing guy. I am bereft of talent.
You're with me. We're happy other people can play instruments.
That's right. But I do enjoy music so much. And I haven't really even taken, say, music appreciation, but I have people who are musical in my life. I love movie soundtracks. That's kind of where I really cut my teeth. It was a little bit before 1977 with the first Star Wars film, but by the time that happened and hearing the music of John Williams, I mean, really anyone who was alive that age was impressed and was many, I can't say everyone, but was impacted by that music. And even now I love, in a kind of amateur-y sort of way, trying to dissect music and understand, well, why did the key change there? Why are they doing this or why are they doing that? And yet our world today, it's almost like we have too much music, because the bar for getting something out to the public is so low, and it's so tainted by everything. But yet we have amazingly talented musicians and songwriters in the world. And the idea that for 1,000 years, the most talented people on earth will be cut loose from the bonds of the devil to actually produce music that we can listen to guilt-free and enjoy, and not just music to praise God with, but other songs as well, other compositions, other music. I can't wait. I feel like I'm going to say a world filled with music. Let me qualify that. In one sense, we kind of have a world filled with music, because I'm literally surrounded in just your office alone with multiple things that could all be playing different songs right now. I don't mean that. I mentioned earlier this kind of Jane Austen stuff. We've been watching some of these old BBC shows and such, and how they would get together, and if someone could play piano, they would play the piano in the room and they would all listen. I feel like we're going to have, because God clearly values music, there'll be the presence of music in the millennium, but it will be back to a more personal kind of enjoyment, and that people will be instructed on how to make good music. There'll be a focus on right principles that I think will maybe produce things we couldn't even imagine hearing now, because who knows, when you've got the influence of the divine creator in the world who has actually crafted the brain and the ear, what sort of new things we might hear.
So I'm going to ask the question that I know I cannot be the only one wondering about. And that is, what music is that we currently enjoy is going to make the cut in the millennium. So I'll be blunt about it. You could ask several different things. Will there be any concept of an electrified musical instrument? Can you have an electric guitar? Can you have an electric bass? Okay, let's say maybe no. Will we still have something that we would recognize in a style that's similar to modern rock and roll, which even modern rock and roll has died? So, but is every style? Are there just going to be certain style of musics that we just don't make anymore?
Right. I have to say yes, but I would be careful about deciding what all of those are, because one, I'm certainly tainted myself. I live in this world, and also it's difficult. I do believe that the rule of Philippians 4:8 will apply. Whatever things are good, whatever things are noble, because it is the power of poetry and the power of music that it doesn't just inform you, it points you in a direction, and it's almost inherent in that. And we have to be careful about that, though. Like, for instance, one of my favorite pieces of classical music is the Barber's Adagio.
Oh, that, yes.
Oh, yeah. And it can be so sad. And for someone who has a personality that lends itself to feeling, say, depressed too quickly, I don't even know I'd recommend it. At the same time, it is amazing that wordlessly, it almost universally conveys that same emotion to listeners. And yeah, I know for me, it doesn't actually make me feel sad, but it does put me in a very pensive, thoughtful kind of mode, and that's not a negative thing. But I have heard, and this was not someone in the church, but I had gotten a book, oh man, I don't know, a long time ago. It was actually some guy speculating about God and math. This was decades ago, but it had my interest. And I want to say it was in that book or something else where he recommended there would be no electric music, that God would not condone that as music, because he didn't see it as music. He said, essentially, if you look at like say an electric guitar, it's essentially a feedback, and the feedback has just been kind of forced into a waveform or something. Okay. Now, look, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't want to. I actually wonder if we're even going to have electrical power grids, in the future. Who knows what we're going to have?
I'm going to go on the record now.
Okay, so given that, I do though. Let me be open to that. I wouldn't be surprised if we come up with different musical instruments of some sort. Why wouldn't we? At the same time, I know mankind has already explored and discovered many fundamental principles of music, but will there be actually different kind? Will we be at the feast at year 637 and see people coming from, I don't know, let's say Norway or Ethiopia, and they have discovered a new approach to the lute or to the sound box or something that makes I don't know. I would anticipate that we would actually have some new discoveries.
I think that's that not only is it balanced, but it makes a lot of sense.
Well, thanks. Well, I don't want to linger on that one a lot, but I do look forward to the music that mankind will produce. And I don't want it to go in this direction, because suddenly you open up a whole, I want to say can of worms, because instead it's beautiful. But just imagine what the glorified family of God will be able to do with music, because now you're not even limited to the physical things, right? You're in the heavenly spheres and access to be able to what you do for music. Mr. DeSimone had a wonderful sermon this past Sabbath about the blessings of being in the first resurrection, and just having our capacities opened up to being beyond the physical limitations. I'm excited about. Which, by the way, I should mention. I want to mention back at point 3 about a new language, that it did remind me of the article in the current Tomorrow's World, not the one we're about to publish, that Mr. Bill Bomer wrote for the Tomorrow's, the works of his hands, about language, about how God designed us to be able to speak language. And I thought, actually, that's kind of interesting. I'll do my best to remember to put a link to that on the livingyouth.org website. Okay, the last point today, and this ties into some of the things we said at the very beginning of concerning the temple, but I look forward to seeing art. But when I say art, yes, I do mean the kind of masterpieces that artists might produce, whether that's paintings, whether that's sculptures. I do look forward, kind of like with music, to have our artistic individuals and classes freed from the burden of sin and even taught directly by the God family to think in new and better ways and to see what our artisans will be able to come up with. But more than that, I don't mean just art in terms of, again, conscious, like specifically something just made as a piece of art. I believe, this is speculation perhaps, but I would like to think that we'll see a level of artistry put back into even the everyday things in the world. I mean, yes, sometimes you just need a chair, but when a man is crafting a chair, he wants a good chair. And if you go back to, say, the Renaissance, or go back to times when artisans had great skills and poured themselves into making worthwhile things, then a chair could be beautiful. You know, I remember seeing it was a Twitter thread that I follow where they're talking about how they look back at the culture in Europe when beauty was important, and they showed a door, and it was just a door of a home, but even the doorknob had some artistry put into it. The person cared about making a beautiful doorknob. And then you open the door, and even the width of the door that normally be hidden in the jamb actually had some engraving. I mean, people cared about the products that they produced. And I want to say it might have been that thread or someone else. They were highlighting that beauty serves a purpose. Beauty announces that the crafter cared about what he made. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just functional. He wanted something of quality. And I feel like the world will be one in which that investment is present. And I'm not endorsing the movie when I say this thing, but it reminds me of what I read about the Peter Jackson original Lord of the Rings trilogy, because I remember reading some comments by actors saying they were putting on these costumes and they couldn't believe the intricate detail that the artisans put. In fact, some things they knew the camera would never see, mm-hmm. because it's on the inside of the material, but they could tell they were wearing something that was so lovingly handcrafted. And I think that's what we're going to see in the Millennium.
I love that.
My belief.
You know what you're saying is that, frankly, art can inspire, and I know that's not a new thing, but we always think, I don't know, I think if we're being lazy, I'll just speak for myself and not thinking too deeply about it. We think of like art and design and beautiful architecture as just being beautiful, but it really is inspiring. You know, I'll have to mention my friend Jordan Peterson. Listening to one of his lectures when he traveled around Europe, and he was in Edinburgh. We say Edinburgh in America, and over there it's Edinburgh. And he said, you know, this is considered one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, and I think that's probably a fair critique. But he points out, he says, why do people spend thousands of dollars to come to Europe? And part of it is that the old world, the old buildings. I mean, America for a brief time used to make buildings like that had some effort put into it and were not just basic cookie cutter things, and had I think one of a good example of that was when the railroad was trying to go, I guess up to a certain point, you had to get off the railroad and take a ferry into Manhattan Island, and they wanted the railroad to go all the way into Manhattan Island. So there's this elaborate tunneling that they had done that was a big deal, and I'm sure people lost their lives building it because it was very dangerous. But they completed it, and as part of the celebration, they made Penn Station. And Penn Station was incredible, and it's all this like marble and just finely crafted, and like you walk into it and you're like, this is the most amazing train station I've ever been in. But over time it became neglected, and it doesn't even exist anymore. And this thing was like the crown, not like go too far, but was one of the most amazing things we've probably ever built.
I've seen multiple Twitter threads devoted to Penn Station and photographs.
And what did we do in the United States, at least somewhere maybe around the 60s? We kind of stopped putting the effort into the buildings, and it all became, well, what's the cheapest way we can build this? Not everything, but many things. And now we have shopping centers go up practically overnight, and they're built soullessly with just, you know, again, cookie cutter things that have no, there's no inspiration to them other than I can go in there and buy stuff, you know?
Yeah, 100%. It's like, one, we lost the idea of what was beautiful and replaced it with what was weird, new, and different. And suddenly it became, you made a building just like, oh, this looks like a weird oval upside down shape or something. And so you got this kind of weird experimentalism going on, and we lost sense of what's beautiful to just what can I do? Mm-hmm. And then, just function. just, hey, it's a building that won't fall, and we can go in and we can buy stuff. And we have lost so much of that. But God does care about that things are done beautifully when they can be. I list. I'm not going to read all the verses, but in Exodus, I listed several where he talked about how the artisans he wanted to work on the tabernacle, and how he said he gave them the gift, to be able to do this. And it speaks of those artisans in Exodus 28:3, 31:6, 35:10, 35:25, 36:8. If you want to look those up, you can slow down the podcast and go write them down and look them up. But God wanted the temple. Why? Because what's beautiful inspires us, and it shows that it matters. Something that's beautiful matters. And I think it's important that God chose the word he did when in Isaiah 61 and verse 3. When God talks about this time to come, he says that he's going to give the people beauty for ashes. That is, we have made of the world ashes. And honestly, when I look at just some plain, ugly concrete building, to me, that's the ashes the world has come to in a certain kind of way. I'm clearly stretching that a bit. But that God is going to teach us that beauty matters. God didn't have to make sunsets beautiful. He just needed to make them functional. The sun's got to go up and down, but instead he made them gorgeous. And I see that spreading hopefully to that time that we saw, for instance, in Europe. Not when it was, say, so excessive, when something that should be available to the common man only the rich could have, right? But still, there was a time when even your common items were made for, even if there was simplicity, it was a beautiful simplicity because beauty shows that we care about that, because nothing is made in a sense that's man-made naturally beautiful. It takes effort to do that, and it'll be a world in which effort, I believe some effort will be spent, and it'll be a more beautiful world.
So then, to bring it full circle, one of the things I like, obviously the previous two temples were in Jerusalem, so in that it's not a new thing that they're combined, but I'm just fascinated to see how the temple complex is, which is clearly much bigger and builds in these gardens, but it's also, there next to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem's going to be the kind of the pearl, if you will, of the cities, and with Christ residing there. Again, to go back to some of these European cities, one of the things I appreciated actually was how it probably was more practical at that time. You just built your city around the feature. If it was kind of in the side of a hill and streets went up and down, around and curved, but it also made a uniqueness to it instead of, so many of the cities I've lived in the States are just along compass points, and they're just straight this way and that. And if there's a hill there, we'll just bulldoze that if necessary.
Right.
But anyway, I appreciate your podcast. Well, the suggestion, you know who you are.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And going through this again and thinking about this going into the feast, because, it's some dark times ahead, but we have a lot to look forward to.
We have a bright, bright future to look forward to.